On the night before D-Day, while thousands of ships rocked in the dark waters of the English Channel, and young men tried to sleep knowing many of them would be dead by sunrise, one man sat alone with a pen in his hand and wrote a message accepting full responsibility for failure. Not victory. Failure. He folded it, put it in his pocket, and prepared to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the most dangerous operation in human history. His name wasn't Patton. It wasn't Montgomery. It wasn't Churchill. It was Dwight Eisenhower, a man who, just a few years earlier, almost nobody outside the Army had ever heard of. He never led a charge up a beach. He never fired a shot in combat in World War I. And yet, the fate of Europe rested on his decision. How did a relatively unknown officer from Kansas rise to command the largest invasion force ever assembled? How did he control the egos of legendary generals who barely tolerated each other? And why did the quietest man in the room become the one everyone listened to when it mattered most? This isn't just the story of D-Day. This is the untold story of the man who had to make the call and live with it. The room is thick with cigarette smoke. Maps cover the walls. Telephones buzz, typewriters clatter, and a dozen senior officers argue in low, urgent voices about a war that is spreading like fire across continents. In the center of it all stands a tall, calm officer with tired eyes and a steady voice. He listens more than he speaks, and when he finally does speak, the room quiets. Within a few years, he will command the greatest invasion force in history. But right now, in 1941, almost nobody outside these walls knows his name. Dwight David Eisenhower is about to step onto the stage of history, but his story did not begin here. It began far from war rooms and world maps, in a small, dusty town called Abilene, Kansas. The air there smelled of earth and livestock, of wood smoke drifting from chimneys in winter. The wind rolled across open plains without mercy, and life demanded toughness. Eisenhower was born in Texas in 1890, but he was raised in Kansas, in a modest home crowded with 6 brothers. There was no wealth, no political legacy, no family tradition of military glory. What there was discipline, faith, hard work. His mother believed deeply in education and moral character. His father worked long hours to keep food on the table. From them, young Dwight learned something more powerful than ambition: restraint. As a boy, he loved football. The crack of helmets, the sting of cold air in his lungs, the pounding rhythm of bodies colliding on frozen fields. He played hard, sometimes recklessly. He broke bones. He learned pain. But he also learned teamwork, the quiet understanding that no victory belongs to one man alone. It is a lesson that would follow him into war. In 1911, Eisenhower entered the United States Military Academy at West Point. The stone buildings loomed gray and severe along the Hudson River. The mornings smelled of damp stone and polished brass. Cadets marched in stiff uniforms, boots striking pavement in perfect rhythm. It was a world of strict rules and relentless pressure. Eisenhower struggled at first. He was not the top student academically, nor the most naturally gifted officer in training. But he observed. He adapted. He built relationships. He graduated in 1915 in a class later known as the class the stars fell on, because so many of its members would eventually become generals. Among his classmates were men who would later command armies in Europe and the Pacific. They could not have known it then, but the friendships and rivalries formed in those years would shape the leadership structure of the Second World War. When the First World War erupted in Europe, Eisenhower was ready. Or at least he thought he was. He wanted combat. He trained tank crews in the United States, drilling men in dusty camps where the smell of oil and hot metal filled the air. Tanks were still new then, metal beasts crawling across trenches. He believed he would lead them in France, but the orders never came. The war ended before he set foot on European soil. For many officers, missing combat meant missing glory. It could stall a career. Eisenhower felt the sting of frustration. He had trained men who went overseas without him. He heard their stories secondhand. He understood what he had not experienced. But instead of allowing resentment to consume him, he did something far more important. He learned the machinery of war from the inside. War is not only fought at the front. It is organized in offices, planned in quiet rooms, supplied by railroads and ships. It is like an enormous orchestra. The frontline soldiers are the visible performers, but behind them are composers, conductors, and stagehands. Eisenhower began to understand the backstage world of conflict. After the war, he served under officers influenced by General John J. Pershing's reforms. The U.S. Army was modernizing. Planning became more systematic. Logistics, the art of moving food, fuel, ammunition, and men, became central. If strategy is the brain of an army, logistics is its bloodstream. Without it, nothing moves. Eisenhower absorbed this deeply. In the 1920s, he worked closely with a rising and controversial figure, Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was brilliant, theatrical, and supremely confident. The air around him felt charged, almost electric. He believed in bold strokes and dramatic gestures. Eisenhower served as his aide and later accompanied him to the Philippines. In Manila, the tropical air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of salt water and jungle vegetation. Political tensions simmered as the United States prepared the Philippines for eventual independence. Eisenhower was tasked not just with military planning, but with delicate diplomacy. He had to balance American interests with Filipino leadership, manage egos, and navigate political landmines. Working under MacArthur was not easy. MacArthur dominated rooms. He expected loyalty. He could be dismissive. But Eisenhower watched, learned, and endured. He developed a talent for managing powerful personalities without becoming one himself. It was not submission, it was strategy. He understood that influence often works best when it is quiet. By the 1930s, storm clouds gathered again over Europe. Adolf Hitler rose in Germany. Mussolini strutted across Italy. Japan expanded across Asia. The world was tilting toward catastrophe. In the United States, isolationism still held sway, but within the Army, planning began in earnest. Eisenhower served in various staff positions, refining contingency plans. These plans were theoretical. What if Germany attacked France? What if Britain fell? What if America had to mobilize millions? The scale was staggering. Planning a modern war was like preparing to move entire cities across oceans. Then, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The world ignited. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, tore through Europe. Tanks and aircraft worked together like hammer and lightning bolt. Countries fell in weeks. France collapsed. Britain stood alone. In Washington, tension tightened like a drawn wire. The War Department buzzed with urgency. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall searched for officers who could think not just tactically, but globally. Marshall valued clarity, discipline, and integrity. He did not want showmen. He wanted results. Eisenhower, still relatively unknown outside military circles, impressed Marshall with something simple yet rare: the ability to present complex plans clearly. He could explain vast operations in plain language. He could break down massive troop movements as if describing a football play. Marshall noticed. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the smell of smoke and burning fuel hung over the Pacific. America was at war. The scale was unprecedented. Millions would be mobilized. Factories would roar day and night. The United States would have to coordinate with allies across oceans. Marshall called Eisenhower to Washington. In the War Department's corridors, footsteps echoed against marble floors. Telephones rang without pause. Officers hurried past with stacks of papers under their arms. Eisenhower stepped into this chaos not as a battlefield hero, but as a planner. Within months, he rose from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. The promotion was astonishingly fast. Some senior officers bristled. Who was this relatively obscure officer to rise so quickly? But Marshall trusted him. Eisenhower's strength became clear in meeting after meeting. British officers arrived with their own strategies. American commanders had different priorities. Political leaders demanded results. Imagine trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician believes they should lead. Eisenhower did not overpower them. He listened. He found common ground. He built consensus. He understood something fundamental. In modern war, no single nation could win alone. Coalition warfare was like a complex machine with parts made in different factories, speaking different languages, operating at different speeds. If even one gear jammed, the entire mechanism could fail. At night, after long hours, he would sit quietly, reviewing maps, tracing possible fronts with his finger. The paper felt rough beneath his skin. The responsibility weighed heavily. He knew the decisions being drafted in these rooms would send young men into fire. He had never commanded troops in combat. He had never charged across a battlefield. Yet he was being positioned at the center of something immense. His rise was not built on medals, but on trust. By late 1941, as American industry began to mobilize and Allied cooperation deepened, Eisenhower stood at a threshold. The boy from Kansas had become a general in the most powerful army in the world. But greater trials lay ahead. He would soon be sent overseas, into a theater where Allied forces struggled to find their footing, where British and American pride collided, and where the outcome of the war hung in fragile balance. In the coming months, he would face his first true test of coalition command, not in theory, not on paper, but in blood and sand, and the world would begin to learn his name. The wind that swept across the airfields of England carried the smell of rain and fuel, and with it came a realization that planning on paper was over. Dwight Eisenhower stood on foreign soil now, far from Washington's polished floors, facing a war that was already burning across North Africa and Europe. He had risen with astonishing speed, but rank meant nothing if he could not deliver results. The Allies were losing ground, morale was uneven, and distrust simmered just beneath the surface between British and American commanders. This would be his first real test, not just of strategy, but of leadership under fire. In the summer of 1942, Eisenhower received orders that would change his life. He was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force for the invasion of North Africa, known as Operation Torch. It was a bold gamble. American troops had little combat experience. The British had been fighting for years and had endured crushing setbacks. The Germans and Italians were entrenched across the desert, hardened by months of brutal warfare. The Mediterranean sun scorched everything it touched. Sandstorms could blind entire columns, and the politics were even more treacherous than the battlefield. Eisenhower arrived in London to coordinate with British leadership. The war rooms there were dimly lit, filled with maps marked in colored pins. Cigarette smoke drifted thick in the air. British officers spoke in clipped tones, confident but weary. At the center of British political leadership stood Winston Churchill, a man of immense willpower and theatrical presence. Churchill believed in striking at what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, the Mediterranean, before attempting a direct invasion of France. The Americans, eager and newly engaged, initially favored a cross-channel assault. But reality forced compromise. Eisenhower's role was not to impose American will. It was to unify two nations with different priorities, traditions, and military cultures. He listened carefully. He asked questions. He absorbed British concerns while maintaining American objectives. In private meetings, his voice remained calm even when tensions rose. He understood something crucial. Alliances do not survive on force of personality alone. They survive on mutual respect. Operation Torch launched in November 1942. Allied ships crossed dark waters toward the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder on crowded decks, smelling salt air and oil, gripping rifles as waves slapped against hulls. Many were barely out of training camps in the United States. For them, this was not a theoretical war. It was terrifyingly real. The landings achieved partial surprise, but resistance varied. In some places, French forces loyal to Vichy Germany fought back. In others, negotiations prevented bloodshed. Eisenhower's headquarters was flooded with conflicting reports, radio messages crackling with urgency, updates scribbled in haste. He had to make decisions quickly, balancing diplomacy with force. Securing cooperation from French commanders required delicate negotiation. It was not a clean battlefield. It was a political labyrinth. As Allied troops pushed inland, they encountered the experienced forces of the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The desert stretched endlessly, flat and unforgiving. Tanks moved like metal predators across open terrain. Artillery thundered without the cover of forests or hills. The smell of cordite hung heavy in the hot air. For inexperienced American units, the shock was immediate. Then came the Battle of Kasserine Pass in early 1943. German forces punched through American lines with alarming speed. Units faltered. Command structures wavered. The defeat was sharp and humiliating. For Eisenhower, it was a defining moment. He could not hide behind excuses. The press would question American readiness. British allies would question American competence. The enemy sensed weakness. But Eisenhower did not panic. He moved swiftly to restructure command. He placed greater responsibility in the hands of aggressive leaders like George S. Patton, whose fiery discipline transformed shaken troops into hardened fighters. Patton brought strict training, sharp uniforms, and relentless energy. He demanded excellence and got it. Eisenhower supported him, even when Patton's ego and temperament sparked controversy. Eisenhower knew how to use talent without being overshadowed by it. At the same time, he worked closely with British commanders, including Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was methodical, cautious, and deeply confident in his own judgment. He preferred meticulous preparation over risky improvisation. His approach clashed at times with American aggressiveness. Meetings between these men could feel tense, like currents colliding beneath calm waters. Eisenhower stood between them. He did not match Patton's bravado or Montgomery's self-assured precision. Instead, he served as the anchor. He absorbed their disagreements, smoothed their rivalries, and kept their focus aligned on the broader objective: defeating the Axis in North Africa. Leadership in coalition warfare, he realized, was less about commanding troops directly and more about commanding personalities. By May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. The victory was significant. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops were captured. The Mediterranean Sea lanes began to open. Allied confidence rose. Eisenhower had passed his first test, not perfectly, but decisively. The campaign shifted next to Sicily. Operation Husky launched in July 1943. Allied aircraft roared overhead as paratroopers descended into the night sky, the scent of fuel thick in the air. Amphibious landings followed along rugged coastlines. Once again, coordination between British and American forces was critical. Weather disrupted airborne drops. Units became scattered. Chaos reigned in pockets. Yet the invasion succeeded. Sicily fell within weeks. The campaign forced political change in Italy, leading to the downfall of Mussolini. The war in Europe began to shift in momentum. For Eisenhower, Sicily reinforced a key lesson. Even flawed operations could achieve strategic gains if the alliance remained intact. Throughout these campaigns, he rarely sought personal glory. He spent hours reviewing logistics reports, fuel consumption, ammunition supplies, shipping schedules. If strategy is choosing where to strike, logistics is ensuring the fist can actually land the blow. Eisenhower understood that moving armies across oceans required industrial coordination on a scale never before attempted. Ships had to depart at precise intervals. Supplies had to arrive without interruption. Delays could cost lives. His days were long. His uniform often smelled faintly of sweat and dust. He wrote letters to families of fallen soldiers. He walked through field hospitals where the scent of antiseptic mingled with quiet suffering. These moments grounded him. The war was not abstract. It was human. In conferences with Allied leaders, larger questions emerged. Should the Allies push deeper into Italy? Should they prioritize a cross-channel invasion of France? Churchill favored continued Mediterranean operations, believing they would weaken Germany gradually. American planners argued that only a direct assault on Western Europe could end the war decisively. Eisenhower found himself navigating these strategic debates while maintaining trust on both sides. He communicated regularly with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose steady support reinforced American commitment. Roosevelt believed in Eisenhower's ability to unify Allied efforts. That trust would soon elevate him even further. By late 1943, it became clear that the ultimate objective would be the liberation of France. A massive amphibious assault across the English Channel was inevitable. The scale would dwarf anything attempted before. It would require millions of men, thousands of ships, and flawless coordination between air, sea, and land forces. Eisenhower's performance in North Africa and Sicily positioned him as the natural choice to lead that endeavor. He had proven he could handle pressure. He had managed clashing egos without fracturing the alliance. He had adapted after setbacks. Most importantly, he had earned the confidence of both American and British leadership. But with elevation came heavier burdens. Returning to England to prepare for the next phase, he faced a new reality. This was no longer about securing North African ports or Mediterranean islands. It was about breaking Fortress Europe. The German defenses along the French coast were formidable. Concrete bunkers, minefields, artillery batteries, a wall of steel and sand. The planning rooms grew more intense. Maps of Normandy replaced those of Tunisia and Sicily. Colored strings marked potential landing beaches. Intelligence briefings detailed German troop placements. Weather patterns were studied obsessively. Every decision carried enormous consequences. Eisenhower knew the alliance could fracture under the strain of such a colossal undertaking. Patton wanted bold, sweeping maneuvers. Montgomery advocated for concentrated, carefully prepared thrusts. Air commanders argued over priorities. Naval officers demanded clarity on landing sequences. It was like assembling a machine with parts built by different craftsmen, each convinced their component was the most vital. He spent countless hours in conversation, sometimes gently steering discussions back to common objectives, sometimes firmly overruling disputes. His authority was growing, but he wielded it carefully. He did not humiliate subordinates. He did not shout for effect. Instead, he relied on calm reasoning and quiet determination. Privately, he carried doubts. The memory of Kasserine Pass lingered. He knew that even the best-laid plans could unravel. He also knew that failure in the next phase would not simply be a tactical setback. It could prolong the war for years. As 1943 drew to a close, the atmosphere in Allied headquarters shifted from cautious optimism to focused urgency. The invasion of Western Europe was no longer a distant possibility. It was a looming certainty. The beaches of France were being studied inch by inch. Training intensified. Troops practiced amphibious landings along English coasts, boots splashing through cold surf, the smell of brine mixing with diesel exhaust. Eisenhower walked among them at times, speaking with soldiers, shaking hands, offering encouragement. He did not speak in grand, dramatic flourishes. He spoke plainly. He listened. The men saw in him not a distant figure, but a steady presence. The transformation was nearly complete. The once relatively unknown officer from Kansas had become the central pillar of Allied command in Europe. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead, a challenge that would test not only his strategic mind, but his courage to make a single irreversible decision. Soon, the world would hold its breath as ships gathered in English harbors, as paratroopers checked their gear in the dark, as weather forecasts were scrutinized with desperate hope. And Dwight Eisenhower would stand at the center of it all, preparing to give the order that would change history. The maps now cover entire walls. Not just Tunisia, not just Sicily. An entire coastline, France, marked in red grease pencil. Arrows stretch across the English Channel like veins leading to a heart that must be pierced. Outside the windows of Allied headquarters in England, the sky hangs low and gray, heavy with coastal mist. Inside, the air smells of ink, damp wool uniforms, and tension. The invasion is no longer an idea. It is becoming a countdown, and Dwight Eisenhower, the quiet general who built alliances in desert heat and Mediterranean dust, is about to carry a burden no commander has ever faced. By late 1943, the war had reached a turning point. The Axis had been pushed out of North Africa. Italy was collapsing under Allied pressure. But Germany still occupied Western Europe, and Adolf Hitler's armies remained formidable. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was absorbing unimaginable casualties, grinding forward mile by mile. Joseph Stalin demanded a second front in the West. Not promises, not peripheral campaigns, but a massive assault to relieve pressure on his forces. The political pressure was immense. In November 1943, at the Tehran Conference, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin met face to face. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and cigars. Behind closed doors, history shifted. The three leaders agreed that a cross-channel invasion would take place in 1944. There would be no more debate. The operation would be called Overlord, and someone would have to command it. Roosevelt and Marshall made their choice. Eisenhower would return to England, this time not as a regional commander, but as Supreme Allied Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. The responsibility was staggering. He would oversee British, American, Canadian, and other Allied troops. He would coordinate air, sea, and land forces on a scale never attempted. If the invasion failed, it could fracture the alliance and prolong the war indefinitely. When Eisenhower arrived in England once more, winter winds cut through the countryside. Fields were muddy. Airfields buzzed with activity. Troops flooded into staging areas by the hundreds of thousands. Convoys rumbled down narrow roads. Headlights dimmed to avoid detection. The smell of gasoline hung constantly in the air. England had become an armed camp. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAF, was established as the brain of the coming invasion. Inside its corridors, typewriters clacked relentlessly. Intelligence officers spread reconnaissance photos across tables. Engineers calculated tide schedules and beach gradients. Meteorologists tracked Atlantic weather systems with obsessive focus. It was like preparing for the largest, most complex mechanical operation in history, except the machine was made of man. Eisenhower understood that Overlord was not simply a landing. It was a synchronized ballet of destruction and precision. Thousands of ships would have to arrive at exact moments. Airborne divisions would drop behind enemy lines at night. Naval bombardments would soften defenses seconds before infantry hit the beaches. If even one major component failed, the chain reaction could be catastrophic. The chosen landing area was Normandy. It offered beaches within range of Allied air cover, yet was less heavily fortified than the Pas-de-Calais region, which the Germans expected to be the likely target. Still, Normandy was no gift. German forces had been constructing the Atlantic Wall, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, anti-tank obstacles, minefields. On aerial photographs, the coastline looked like a jagged line of steel teeth. Deception would be critical. Operation Fortitude was conceived to mislead German intelligence into believing the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Fake armies were created. Inflatable tanks were placed in English fields. Dummy landing craft were arranged along coastlines. Radio traffic was deliberately fabricated. Even General George S. Patton, whose reputation for aggression made him believable as an invasion commander, was assigned to lead a phantom force, the 1st United States Army Group. It was theater on a grand scale, designed to trick one of the most sophisticated military machines in the world. Eisenhower monitored these deception plans closely. He knew that convincing the Germans to hold divisions away from Normandy could mean the difference between success and slaughter. Intelligence briefings became daily rituals. Officers studied intercepted communications and reconnaissance reports, searching for signs that the ruse was working. Meanwhile, tensions simmered within the Allied command itself. Bernard Montgomery was appointed to oversee ground forces for the invasion's initial phase. He proposed expanding the landing front to include 5 beaches instead of 3. His reasoning was strategic. A wider front would reduce congestion and allow faster buildup. but it required more resources and greater risk. American planners worried about overextension. Meetings grew heated. Eisenhower listened carefully as Montgomery laid out his arguments with characteristic certainty. He also weighed American concerns. In the end, he approved the expanded plan. It was a calculated risk. He understood that unity in command mattered as much as tactical detail. If he undermined Montgomery publicly, cracks could form in the alliance's structure. So he gave Montgomery authority, but retained ultimate oversight. Logistics became a constant drumbeat. Millions of tons of equipment had to be stockpiled: ammunition, rations, medical supplies, fuel. Artificial harbors, called mulberries, were designed to be towed across the channel and assembled off the beaches to facilitate unloading. Underwater pipelines, known as Pluto, were conceived to pump fuel directly from England to France. It was engineering at the edge of imagination. The English countryside changed shape under this weight. Fields filled with tents and vehicles. Roads were deep grooves from heavy trucks. Soldiers practiced scaling cliffs and storming mock bunkers. The air often smelled of wet canvas and engine exhaust. Paratroopers rehearsed jumps, boots thudding on a training grounds as instructors barked corrections. Eisenhower moved constantly between planning rooms and training areas. He understood that leadership required visibility. When he spoke to troops, he did not promise easy victory. He spoke of duty, of shared sacrifice. His tone was steady, almost paternal. Soldiers later recalled feeling reassured by his presence, not inspired by fiery rhetoric, but steadied by quiet confidence. Intelligence officers brought troubling news. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been inspecting coastal defenses personally. He believed the invasion would be decided on the beaches, and he pushed for more mines, more obstacles, more artillery near the shoreline. The longer the Allies delayed, the stronger those defenses would become. Weather became an unpredictable adversary. The English Channel was notorious for sudden storms. Tides, moonlight, and cloud cover all influenced the timing of airborne drops and naval bombardments. The invasion required a precise combination of conditions: low tide at dawn to expose obstacles, but enough light for pilots and gunners. Meteorologists studied charts late into the night, their eyes strained from reading shifting pressure systems. As spring of 1944 approached, pressure mounted. Stalin demanded confirmation that the invasion would occur as promised. Roosevelt and Churchill needed progress. German U-boats still prowled the Atlantic. Every delay risked exposure of Allied preparations. Inside SHEF, Eisenhower often stood alone before maps long after meetings ended. He traced potential landing routes with his finger, imagining waves of soldiers advancing under fire. He knew the casualty projections. They were not small. He understood that even a successful invasion would cost thousands of lives in the first hours. And yet he also knew that failing to attempt it would condemn Europe to continued occupation and prolonged suffering on the Eastern Front. The stakes were existential. Overlord was not just an operation. It was the hinge on which the future of Europe turned. Political complexities layered atop military planning. Coordination with the French resistance required secrecy and precision. Messages were transmitted through coded phrases broadcast on radio. Sabotage operations would disrupt German rail lines at the critical moment. If resistance cells acted too early, they could be crushed before Allied forces arrived. As June approached, the buildup intensified. More than 150,000 troops were poised across the Channel in the first wave alone. Thousands of ships crowded English ports. The smell of salt water mixed with oil and sweat as sailors prepared landing craft. Paratroopers packed equipment into small bags, each man carrying the weight of his own uncertainty. Eisenhower felt the atmosphere shift from preparation to inevitability. There comes a moment in every great endeavor when planning gives way to action, when doubt must be set aside. That moment was approaching. But nature intervened. Early June brought storms. Winds whipped across the Channel. Waves grew violent. The invasion had been scheduled for June 5th. Meteorologists warned that conditions were deteriorating. Landing craft could capsize. Airborne drops could scatter disastrously. Eisenhower convened his commanders in a small room thick with tension. Rain tapped against windows. Forecast charts lay spread across a table. The decision was agonizing. Postponing would mean unraveling an operation years in the making. Troops were already embarked on ships. Secrecy was fragile, but launching in dangerous weather could doom them. Chief meteorologist James Stagg predicted a brief break in the storm on June 6th. It would not be perfect, but it would be workable. Eisenhower asked each commander for their recommendation. Voices weighed in, some cautious, some confident. Finally, he spoke the words that would echo through history. "Okay, let's go." In that simple phrase lay enormous consequence. The machinery moved into motion. Orders transmitted. Ships departed under cover of darkness. Paratroopers boarded aircraft, engines roaring like distant thunder. Late that night, Eisenhower visited paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. He stood among them as they adjusted parachute straps and blackened faces with grease paint. The air smelled of gasoline and damp grass. Some soldiers joked nervously. Others stared silently into the night. Eisenhower spoke quietly with a few, asking their hometowns, offering encouragement. He smiled for a photograph, an image that would become iconic. But beneath that smile was gravity. Before the invasion began, he wrote a short note accepting full responsibility if the operation failed. It was not dramatic, not eloquent. It was direct. If any blame attached to the attempt, it would be his alone. He folded the note and placed it in his pocket. The final hours before dawn were thick with anticipation. Engines droned overhead as aircraft carried paratroopers across the channel. Naval vessels formed vast convoys stretching to the horizon. Radar screens flickered. Officers checked watches repeatedly. In those moments, Eisenhower was no longer just coordinating personalities or balancing strategy. He had set into motion the largest amphibious assault in human history. The fate of tens of thousands in the coming hours, and perhaps millions in the coming years, hinged on what would unfold next. As the first Allied planes crossed the French coast and anti-aircraft fire began to flash against the dark sky, the waiting ended. Operation Overlord had begun, and Dwight Eisenhower's life and legacy would never be the same. The engines are already in the air when the first flashes appear along the French coast. Tracers streak upward in violent arcs, tearing holes through the darkness. Inside the transport planes, paratroopers grip static lines with numb fingers, the metal floor vibrating beneath their boots. Red lights glow. The smell of sweat, canvas, and engine oil fills the cabin. Somewhere below them lies Normandy. Somewhere below them are German guns waiting in concrete bunkers. And back in England, in a dimly lit operations room, Dwight Eisenhower listens as the invasion he set in motion begins to unfold beyond his direct control. There is no turning back now. The night of June 6, 1944, begins in chaos. Strong winds scatter airborne units far from their intended drop zones. Pilots struggle through clouds and anti-aircraft fire. Some planes release paratroopers too early, others too late. Men land in flooded fields, tangled in hedgerows, alone in darkness with only the distant crack of gunfire to guide them. For many, the first sound of the invasion is not a shouted command, but the splash of boots in cold water. Eisenhower receives fragmentary reports through crackling radio lines. Messages arrive incomplete, garbled by interference. He knows the plan called for airborne divisions to secure key bridges and roads behind the beaches, to disrupt German reinforcements before the main landings. But war never unfolds precisely as planned. The question is not whether there will be confusion. There is always confusion, but whether the confusion can be overcome. As dawn approaches, the horizon over the English Channel begins to lighten. From high above, the sea looks like a moving steel field. Thousands of ships stretch across the water. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft packed tightly together. The sound is overwhelming. Engines rumbling, waves slapping hulls, sailors shouting orders over the wind. On the decks of landing craft, soldiers crouch shoulder to shoulder. Some clutch rosaries. Some stare silently at the gray line of France growing closer. In the headquarters where Eisenhower stands, the air feels suffocating. Cigarette smoke hangs heavy. Officers hover over maps, tracing beach sectors with pencils. The 5 landing zones, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, are etched into memory now. Each represents thousands of men about to face machine gun fire at point-blank range. Naval bombardment begins. The thunder of battleship guns rolls across the water, a deep, shaking sound that rattles windows even miles away. Shells arc toward the coast, exploding against cliffs and bunkers. The ground trembles. Sand and smoke rise in dark columns. Yet many German positions survive, reinforced with concrete and steel. At Utah Beach, American forces land slightly off target due to strong currents. It is a mistake that turns into fortune. The defenses are lighter than expected. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., wading ashore with a cane in hand, makes a quick decision to redirect troops inland from where they land. Casualties are heavy, but manageable. Progress is steady. At Omaha Beach, however, the story is different. As the first waves approach, machine guns open fire from elevated bluffs. Bullets strike the water with sharp, snapping sounds. Landing craft ramps drop, and men step in a chest-deep surf under direct fire. The smell of cordite and salt fills the air. Some soldiers fall before they can even reach dry sand. Others huddle behind steel obstacles, pinned down by relentless gunfire. Reports from Omaha reach Eisenhower slowly. Casualty estimates are unclear. For a moment, fear grips Allied headquarters that the beachhead might collapse entirely. If Omaha fails, the entire invasion could unravel. Eisenhower stands motionless, absorbing updates, his face controlled but tense. He cannot rush to the beach. He cannot fire a rifle. His battlefield is this room. He asks for specifics. Are naval guns adjusting their aim? Are reinforcements landing? Is the tide rising? Each detail matters. His role now is to prevent panic from spreading through command channels. Panic is contagious. Calm must be equally so. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juneau, and Sword Beaches encounter fierce resistance, but push inland steadily. Tanks designed to swim ashore, the so-called DD tanks, struggle in rough waters. Some sink before reaching land. Engineers clear obstacles under fire, hands shaking as they defuse mines with seconds to spare. The beach sand is churned with blood and debris. Above the beaches, Allied aircraft roar overhead, strafing German positions. Paratroopers who landed scattered throughout the night begin to regroup. Small bands of men, often from different units, form improvised teams and attack objectives with determination. Bridges are seized. Causeways are secured. The chaos of the airborne drops transforms into pockets of effective resistance. Back at SHAEF, Eisenhower continues receiving updates. The room feels smaller as the hours pass. Coffee cups pile up on tables. Officers speak in hushed tones, aware that every word may carry consequence. The greatest fear, that the Germans might launch a massive counterattack and push the Allies back into the sea, lingers in every conversation. German high command hesitates. Deception operations have convinced many in Berlin that Normandy may be a diversion. Adolf Hitler, sleeping late that morning, delays authorization to move armored divisions. Precious hours pass. The false army under Patton's name still holds German attention at Pas-de-Calais. By midday, signs of stabilization at Omaha begin to emerge. Small groups of soldiers climb the bluffs, using craters and terrain for cover. Destroyers move dangerously close to shore, firing directly into German fortifications. Slowly, painfully, the tide begins to turn. Beach exits are secured. Reinforcements flow in. Eisenhower allows himself no visible relief. The battle is far from over. Securing beaches is only the first step. The Allies must link the 5 landing zones into a continuous front. They must bring ashore artillery, vehicles, and supplies. They must push inland before German reserves can organize. As evening approaches, the scale of what has been achieved becomes clearer. More than 150,000 troops have landed in Normandy. Casualties are heavy, thousands killed, wounded, or missing, but the foothold holds. The Atlantic Wall has been breached. Eisenhower finally steps away briefly from the operations table. The weight of the day settles upon him. He knows that victory on the beaches does not guarantee success in the campaign ahead. Normandy is a labyrinth of hedgerows, thick earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation that limit visibility and channel movement. Fighting there will be brutal and slow. That night, the channel remains crowded with ships unloading men and equipment. The artificial mulberry harbors begin to take shape offshore. Engineers work tirelessly, hands blistered, muscles aching. The smell of diesel, mud, and gunpowder lingers over everything. In the days that follow, Allied forces push inland, but encounter fierce resistance. German units regroup quickly. The Bocage country becomes a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Tanks cannot maneuver freely. Infantry advance yard by yard. Every hedgerow could conceal a machine gun. Eisenhower travels to the continent shortly after the landings to assess progress firsthand. He steps on a French soil, now churned by battle. The air smells of smoke and damp earth. He meets commanders, reviews positions, listens to concerns. Soldiers see him walking among them, not as a distant symbol, but as a presence. Montgomery presses for consolidation and careful expansion of the beachhead. Patton, waiting in England with the Third Army, grows restless. He wants action. He wants to exploit any breakthrough with speed and aggression. Eisenhower must balance patience with momentum. The German counterattacks that many feared do not fully materialize at the scale anticipated. Allied air superiority plays a decisive role. Fighter bombers patrol constantly, attacking German convoys attempting to move during daylight. Roads become deadly traps for enemy reinforcements. Yet progress remains slow. The hedgerow battles grind on. Casualty lists lengthen. Families across America, Britain, and Canada receive telegrams bearing tragic news. Eisenhower reads summaries of losses each evening. Numbers on paper represent lives ended, futures erased. The burden presses heavily. He meets frequently with subordinates, encouraging coordination. He refuses to let inter-allied rivalry disrupt focus. When disagreements arise, he listens carefully before making decisions. Authority rests with him, but he wields it with restraint. By late June and into July, the beachhead is secure, but breakout remains elusive. The port of Cherbourg is captured after heavy fighting, providing a crucial logistical gateway. Still, the main German line holds firm inland. Eisenhower understands that the success of Overlord will ultimately be judged not by the landings alone, but by whether Allied forces can break free of Normandy and advance rapidly across France. The world watches closely. Stalin expects swift pressure on German forces. Political leaders seek signs that the immense gamble was justified. One evening, as reports flow in and the sun sets over the channel, Eisenhower reflects quietly. The invasion he authorized has survived its most perilous hours. The beaches are held. The alliance has not fractured under fire. Yet the true campaign, the drive to liberate Europe, is only beginning. The longest day has passed, but its echoes will shape every decision that follows. Ahead lies the struggle to break out of Normandy's hedgerows, to unleash armies across France, and to push toward the heart of Germany itself. And once again, Dwight Eisenhower will have to navigate ambition, caution, and the relentless arithmetic of war. The hedgerows feel like walls built by the earth itself. Thick embankments rise taller than a man, topped with tangled roots and dense brush. Every field is a fortress, every lane a kill zone. The air smells of damp soil and cordite. Flies circle lazily over churned mud where tanks have torn through pasture. And as June turns into July of 1944, the Allied armies that stormed ashore in triumph now find themselves locked in a grinding, claustrophobic struggle just miles inland from the beaches they bled to secure. The world saw the photographs of D-Day. What it did not see was the suffocating weeks that followed. Infantry moved yard by yard, cutting through hedgerows with explosives, crawling under barbed wire, clearing farmhouses that had become German strongpoints. German defenders, veterans hardened on the Eastern Front, used the terrain brilliantly. Machine guns were hidden behind small openings in thick greenery. Mortars fell with frightening precision. Tanks that tried to crest hedgerows exposed their vulnerable underbellies to anti-tank fire. In Supreme Headquarters, Dwight Eisenhower listened to casualty reports that came in with relentless regularity. The initial exhilaration of surviving the landings had given way to grim determination. He knew the breakout had to come. Without it, the invasion risked stagnation. The Allied buildup continued. More divisions landed. More artillery rolled ashore, more fuel and ammunition poured into Normandy. But mass without mobility meant vulnerability. British forces under Montgomery pressed toward Cannes, a key city anchoring the eastern flank of the beachhead. The fighting there was brutal and prolonged. Bombardments reduced parts of the city to rubble, but German armored divisions held stubbornly. Montgomery argued that his operations were drawing German armor eastward, creating opportunity for an American breakout in the West. Critics muttered that progress was too slow. Eisenhower stood between pressure and patience. He had to maintain confidence publicly while assessing realities privately. He refused to let inter-Allied friction fracture momentum. He believed that even imperfect operations served a broader design. On the American sector, General Omar Bradley commanded First Army. Bradley was steady, methodical, respected by his men. Under him, a plan began to take shape: Operation Cobra. It would be the hammer blow needed to shatter the German line in western Normandy. Massive aerial bombardment would precede a concentrated ground assault, punching a hole through weakened defenses near St. Lo. The planning was meticulous. Thousands of heavy bombers were scheduled to carpet a narrow front with explosives. The objective was not merely to kill enemy troops, but to disorient and break their cohesion. If successful, American forces could surge into open terrain beyond the hedgerows, where mobility favored them. On the morning Cobra was launched in late July, the sky over Normandy roared with engines. Bombers droned overhead in tight formations, releasing waves of bombs that shook the ground violently. The air filled with smoke and debris. But war rarely unfolds perfectly. Some bombs fell short, causing tragic friendly fire casualties among American troops. The shock rippled through the ranks. Yet the German line cracked. Infantry and tanks pushed forward through shattered defenses. Suddenly, the terrain opened up. The constricting hedgerows gave way to more maneuverable ground. The breakthrough that commanders had prayed for was finally underway. Eisenhower received word of Cobra's success with cautious relief. He knew a breakthrough was not the same as victory. It had to be exploited rapidly before German forces regrouped. That exploitation would require speed, and speed required an aggressive commander. General George S. Patton was unleashed. Patton's Third Army had been activated, and he surged into Brittany with characteristic intensity. Columns of American armor advanced rapidly, engines growling, dust rising behind them in long trails. Town after town fell. French civilians emerged from hiding, waving flags, embracing soldiers, tears mixing with smiles. Church bells rang in villages that had endured occupation for 4 long years. The liberation of Paris loomed as both a military and symbolic objective. French resistance fighters rose against German forces within the city. Political considerations weighed heavily. Eisenhower initially preferred to bypass Paris to avoid logistical strain and street fighting. But events overtook strategy. Allowing the capital to remain under siege risked chaos and humanitarian disaster. Allied forces entered Paris in late August. Crowds flooded the streets, the air thick with celebration, perfume, and lingering smoke. Eisenhower understood the power of the moment. Paris was not just another city, it was a symbol. Its liberation signaled that Nazi occupation could be reversed. But even as celebrations erupted, Eisenhower's focus remained forward. The German army was retreating toward its borders. The question now was how best to pursue. Here emerged a critical strategic debate: broad front versus narrow thrust. Montgomery advocated concentrating resources for a powerful strike through northern Germany, potentially capturing the Ruhr industrial region swiftly. Patton and other American commanders favored advancing along a wide front, applying pressure across the entire line to prevent German regrouping. Eisenhower leaned toward the broad front approach. He believed that maintaining continuous pressure reduced the risk of counterattack and ensured that no single Allied nation bore disproportionate risk. It was consistent with his philosophy: balance, coordination, unity. Critics argued that a concentrated thrust might end the war sooner. Supporters countered that it risked overextension. Logistics once again dictated possibilities. As Allied forces advanced rapidly across France, supply lines stretched thin. Ports were still being repaired. Rail networks were damaged. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, operated around the clock, moving fuel and ammunition forward. Drivers worked with little rest, headlights dimmed at night, engines overheating in summer heat. Without fuel, tanks were little more than steel statues. Eisenhower pored over logistics reports daily. How much fuel remained? How quickly could it be delivered? Strategy without supply is illusion. He understood that the greatest victories can stall on empty tanks. By September 1944, Allied forces approached Germany's borders. Morale soared. Some believed the war in Europe could end before winter. Yet beneath optimism lay vulnerability. German forces, though battered, were not broken. They withdrew to prepare defensive lines, including the Siegfried Line, a network of bunkers and obstacles along the German frontier. Meanwhile, in the north, Montgomery proposed Operation Market Garden, an audacious airborne operation intended to seize bridges in the Netherlands, opening a corridor into Germany. It was bold, risky, and dependent on precise timing. Eisenhower approved it, balancing his own strategic preference with alliance cohesion. The operation would test, once again, the delicate equilibrium between caution and daring. But before that gamble unfolded, the summer of breakout and liberation had reshaped the war. France was largely free. Allied forces stood poised at Germany's doorstep. Eisenhower's gamble at Normandy had transformed into sweeping momentum across Western Europe. Yet victory had come at a cost. Casualty lists lengthened. Hospitals filled with wounded men whose stories would never appear in headlines. Eisenhower visited some of these hospitals, walking quietly among beds, offering brief words of comfort. He carried the burden of their sacrifice personally. As autumn approached, the air cooled. Leaves turned brittle. The tempo of advance slowed as supply constraints tightened and German resistance stiffened. The war had entered a new phase, no longer a desperate fight to secure a foothold, but a grinding push into the enemy's homeland. Eisenhower's leadership now required even greater steadiness. He had to manage expectations from politicians, from allies, from his own commanders. He knew that wars often appear closest to ending just before they become most dangerous. The breakthrough from Normandy had unleashed Allied power across France. But Germany remained defiant. Its armies retreated in order, preparing to strike back when opportunity arose. And soon, in the cold forests of the Ardennes, that opportunity would come. For now, as Allied columns rolled eastward and the echoes of liberation celebrations faded into the distance, Eisenhower stood at the center of a vast coalition army pressing toward the heart of Europe. The beaches of Normandy were behind him. Ahead lay the final battles of the war, battles that would test not only strategy but endurance. The summer of victory had given way to the uncertain autumn of decision. The sky over the Netherlands fills with silk. Thousands of parachutes bloom at once. white and ghost-like against drifting clouds. Engines roar overhead. Anti-aircraft fire bursts in black puffs around transport planes. On the ground, Dutch civilians look up in awe, hope rising with every descending figure. It feels like liberation falling from the sky. But beneath the spectacle, beneath the boldness of the plan, danger coils tightly. And far away, studying maps as reports begin to trickle in, Dwight Eisenhower senses that the war is about to shift again, not forward in triumph, but sideways into uncertainty. By September 1944, momentum had carried the Allies across France at astonishing speed. German forces retreated toward their homeland. Some believed the war could be finished before Christmas. Yet speed had outpaced supply. Fuel shortages were crippling armored advances. Ports remained damaged. The broad front strategy had stretched Allied lines thin across hundreds of miles. In this atmosphere, Field Marshal Patton Montgomery presented an audacious proposal: Operation Market Garden. The idea was deceptively simple in theory and breathtakingly complex in execution. Airborne divisions would seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands, creating a corridor across rivers and canals. Ground forces would race up this narrow path, cross the Rhine, and drive into the industrial heart of Germany. If successful, it could end the war swiftly. Eisenhower understood the appeal. A decisive thrust might collapse German resistance before winter set in. He also understood the risks. The corridor would be narrow, vulnerable to attack on both flanks. Airborne troops would land far behind enemy lines, dependent on rapid ground relief. Intelligence suggested German armored units were regrouping nearby. Yet rejecting Montgomery's proposal outright could fracture Allied cohesion. Eisenhower believed unity mattered as much as terrain. He approved the operation. On September 17th, the airborne phase began. The sound of engines filled the Dutch sky. Paratroopers descended into fields and pastures, landing amidst startled livestock and cautious villagers. The air smelled of cut grass and gunpowder. Initial objectives were secured with surprising speed. Bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen were captured after fierce fighting. But at Arnhem, the final and most crucial bridge, resistance was far stronger than expected. Elements of 2 German SS Panzer divisions were present, refitting but still formidable. British paratroopers fought desperately in streets lined with brick houses and narrow lanes. Radio communication faltered. Supply drops fell into contested zones. Days stretched on. The ground forces advancing north met stiff resistance along the narrow highway that soldiers grimly called Hell's Highway. Back at headquarters, Eisenhower followed developments with growing concern. Reports were uneven. Optimism in early hours gave way to troubling updates. The bridge at Arnhem remained contested. Relief forces were delayed. Weather grounded aircraft intermittently. The operation, so bold in conception, began to strain under reality. He did not lash out. He did not publicly criticize Montgomery. Instead, he sought clarity. Could additional resources help? Were German reinforcements moving in strength? Was continuation viable, or was withdrawal inevitable? By late September, the answer was clear. The airborne troops at Arnhem were overwhelmed. Survivors withdrew across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Market Garden had failed to achieve its ultimate objective. The failure did not shatter the Allied position, but it dashed hopes of ending the war before winter. German morale stiffened. They had proven capable of resisting, even daring assaults. Eisenhower absorbed criticism quietly. Some American officers argued that too many resources had been concentrated in the north. Others believed the risk had been necessary. In private reflection, he acknowledged the gamble had not paid off, but he refused to assign blame publicly. Coalition warfare required trust. Public discord would only embolden the enemy. As autumn deepened, Allied forces pressed against the German frontier. The Siegfried Line presented a formidable barrier. Concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth obstacles, dense minefields. The forests of the Hürtgen became scenes of grinding combat. Rain turned roads into mud. Cold seeped into bones. Artillery thundered through trees stripped bare by shell fire. Then, In December 1944, the unexpected happened. Before dawn on December 16th, German artillery opened fire across the Ardennes forest. Shells screamed through freezing air. American units, many inexperienced and thinly spread, were caught off guard. Snow covered the ground. Visibility was poor. German infantry and tanks surged forward, creating a bulge in Allied lines. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In headquarters, maps were updated rapidly as reports arrived. Entire regiments were overrun. Roads became clogged with refugees and retreating units. German forces aimed to split Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. Eisenhower moved quickly. He convened commanders, analyzing the shape of the German penetration. The bulge in the line was dangerous, but also potentially vulnerable. German forces advancing into it were extending themselves. He made a critical decision. Rather than retreat widely, Allied forces would hold firm on the shoulders of the bulge while counterattacking from north and south to pinch it off. It was a calculated response that required rapid coordination. In the north, he temporarily placed American forces under Montgomery's command for operational efficiency. It was a controversial move. Some American officers bristled at serving under a British commander, but Eisenhower prioritized unity over pride. He believed efficiency in crisis outweighed sensitivities. In the South, General Patton executed one of the war's most remarkable maneuvers. Within days, his Third Army pivoted north, driving through snow and ice to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. The roads were treacherous. Engines struggled in freezing temperatures. Soldiers marched with breath visible in the bitter air. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division held under relentless German attack. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies dwindled. When German envoys demanded surrender, the American response was a single word: nuts. It became legend. Eisenhower monitored developments hour by hour. He authorized air support when weather cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to strike German columns. Gradually, the German offensive lost momentum. Fuel shortages plagued their tanks. Allied resistance stiffened. By January 1945, the bulge was shrinking. German losses were severe. The gamble had failed. Yet the battle revealed something profound. Even in desperation, Germany could still mount significant offensives. The war was not over. Eisenhower visited the front during the aftermath. Snow crunched under his boots. He saw burned-out vehicles lining roads. He spoke with soldiers whose faces were lined with exhaustion. The winter had been brutal, but the line held. The Ardennes offensive strengthened his resolve. He recognized that Germany's capacity to strike, though diminished, was not extinguished. The final push would require coordinated, relentless pressure. He resumed focus on crossing the Rhine, the last great natural barrier into Germany. Plans accelerated. Bridges would be seized or built under fire. The Allied armies would surge eastward with overwhelming force. Throughout these trials, Eisenhower's leadership style remained consistent. He did not seek headlines. He did not boast of victories. He managed friction quietly, mediated disputes, and kept the coalition aligned. Market Garden had shown the risks of bold thrusts. The Bulge had shown the dangers of complacency. Together, they hardened Allied resolve. Winter gradually loosened its grip. Snow melted into muddy fields. Rivers swelled with runoff. The sound of artillery echoed across German territory. The Allies prepared for the final assault into the heart of the Reich. Eisenhower stood, once again, at the center of decisions that would shape history. Behind him lay the beaches of Normandy, the breakout across France, the gamble in the Netherlands, the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Ahead lay the Rhine, and beyond it, the end of the Third Reich. But ending a war is not as simple as winning battles. It requires judgment, restraint, and clarity of purpose. Soon, Eisenhower would face decisions that would define not only military victory, but the political shape of post-war Europe. The war had tested his ability to manage egos and coordinate armies. The final phase would test something deeper: his vision of how the war should end. The Rhine glitters under a cold, gray sky, wide and ancient, flowing through the heart of Germany like a final line drawn by history itself. On its eastern bank, smoke drifts upward from shattered towns. Bridges lie twisted in the water, blown apart in retreat. For years, this river had symbolized security for the Third Reich, a natural fortress, a barrier that no enemy would cross. Now Allied artillery thunders along its western edge, and Dwight Eisenhower studies maps that show his armies poised at the threshold of Germany's last great defense. The end is close, but how it ends, and who decides that ending, will define not only victory, but legacy. By early 1945, the German offensive in the Ardennes had collapsed. The Bulge was erased. Allied lines were restored. But the winter fighting had been costly. Thousands of men lay buried beneath snow that had since melted into mud. German forces were weakened, yet still capable of stubborn resistance. The question was no longer whether Germany would fall, but how quickly, and at what cost. Eisenhower's armies stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland. In the north, British and Canadian forces pressed through the Netherlands toward the German border. In the center, American 1st and 9th Armies prepared to strike the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. In the south, Patton's 3rd Army churned forward relentlessly, engines rumbling across scarred landscapes. The Rhine was the objective. German planners had hoped to destroy every bridge across it. Most had been demolished. But on March 7, 1945, something unexpected occurred. American troops approaching the town of Remagen discovered the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, damaged but intact. Smoke hung in the air as German engineers attempted to destroy it with explosives. Charges failed. Without hesitation, American soldiers rushed forward under fire, boots pounding across planks as bullets snapped overhead. News of the bridge's capture reached Eisenhower swiftly. He grasped its significance immediately. A foothold east of the Rhine was invaluable. Engineers worked frantically to reinforce the bridge and construct pontoon crossings nearby. German counterattacks hammered the position. Artillery shook the riverbanks. Yet the bridgehead held. Eisenhower did not allow the moment to become reckless triumph. He reinforced success methodically. Additional crossings were planned further north and south, coordinated carefully to prevent German concentration against a single point. When full-scale crossings began later in March, the spectacle was immense. Searchlights illuminated the night sky. Assault boats slipped across dark waters. Artillery barges rolled like distant thunder. The Rhine, once thought impassable, was breached. As Allied forces surged eastward, German resistance fragmented. Entire divisions surrendered. Columns of prisoners marched west under guard, faces hollow, uniforms tattered. Town after town fell. Yet pockets of fierce resistance persisted, especially near the Ruhr. The Ruhr pocket became a decisive objective. This region contained factories, coal mines, rail hubs, the industrial backbone of Germany's war effort. Eisenhower ordered encirclement. American forces closed in from north and south, forming a massive pincer. Inside the pocket, hundreds of thousands of German troops found themselves trapped. Logistically and strategically, it was a masterpiece of coordination. Air superiority strangled German movement. Supply lines for Allied troops, now shorter and more secure, functioned efficiently. The encirclement collapsed organized resistance in the West. And yet, another debate intensified. As Soviet forces advanced relentlessly from the east, capturing territory at immense human cost, the question arose: should Western Allied forces race for Berlin? Politically, the capture of the German capital held enormous symbolic value. Some commanders argued that taking Berlin would strengthen Western influence in post-war Europe. Eisenhower faced one of the most consequential decisions of his career. Intelligence indicated that Berlin lay within the Soviet sphere of operations agreed upon at earlier conferences. The city would likely fall to the Red Army regardless of Western advances. Capturing it would require diverting forces, risking tens of thousands of casualties for a prize that might not alter strategic realities. He chose restraint. Eisenhower informed his commanders that their priority was the destruction of German armies, not the symbolic seizure of Berlin. The objective was to prevent any organized German resistance from retreating into the mountains of southern Germany, the rumored Alpine Redoubt, where die-hard forces might attempt prolonged resistance. This decision was controversial. Critics later argued that Western forces could have reached Berlin first. Supporters emphasized the cost that such a race would have incurred. Eisenhower's reasoning reflected his broader philosophy: victory through coordination and pragmatism, not theatrical gestures. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they began encountering something that reshaped understanding of the war entirely: concentration camps. When American troops liberated Ohrdruf and later Buchenwald, they discovered scenes of horror beyond imagination. The smell was overpowering: decay, smoke, sickness. Emaciated prisoners stumbled forward, skeletal, eyes hollow. Piles of bodies lay in heaps. Guards had fled or been captured. The scale of cruelty stunned even battle-hardened soldiers. Eisenhower insisted that journalists and political leaders witness the camps firsthand. He walked through barracks, his face pale but controlled. He knew that documenting these atrocities was essential. No one should later deny what had occurred. He ordered local German civilians to tour the camps to see what had been done in their name. The war was no longer abstract geopolitics. It was a moral reckoning. Meanwhile, German leadership was collapsing. Adolf Hitler remained in Berlin, issuing increasingly unrealistic orders as Soviet artillery closed in. German cities fell one by one. Communications fractured. Supply networks disintegrated. Allied forces in the West continued advancing rapidly. Patton's Third Army swept through Bavaria. British forces moved toward the Elbe River. American and Soviet troops met at Torgau in late April, shaking hands across the ruins of Europe. The meeting symbolized the closing vice around Nazi Germany. Eisenhower maintained steady communication with Soviet commanders. Coordination was necessary to prevent accidental clashes. The alliance that had defeated Germany remained intact, though tensions about the post-war order simmered beneath the surface. By late April, it was evident that the German government could not continue functioning. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz assumed leadership briefly, seeking terms that might allow German forces to surrender to Western allies while continuing resistance against the Soviets. Eisenhower rejected partial surrender. The demand was unconditional surrender on all fronts. There would be no separate peace. German envoys arrived at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The atmosphere was tense but subdued. The room smelled faintly of paper and fatigue. After years of devastation, the end felt almost anticlimactic. There was no cheering yet, only solemn acknowledgement. On May 7, 1945, German representatives signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. It would take effect the following day. Victory in Europe was achieved. Eisenhower did not celebrate wildly. He understood that while the European war was ending, the war in the Pacific continued. He also knew that victory came at staggering cost, millions dead across continents. He stepped outside briefly after the signing. The air was cool, the night quiet. He had commanded the largest coalition force in history. He had overseen the invasion of Normandy, the liberation of Western Europe, the crossing of the Rhine, and the collapse of the Third Reich. But he also carried memories of beaches soaked in blood, frozen forests in the Ardennes, and the silent barracks of concentration camps. His decision not to race for Berlin would be debated for decades. Yet it reflected the same qualities that defined his rise: coordination over glory, pragmatism over spectacle, unity over ego. As celebrations erupted in London, Paris, and New York, Eisenhower remained composed. He knew that the next chapter of his life was beginning, one shaped not only by military achievement, but by political responsibility. The guns in Europe had fallen silent. The Allied armies stood victorious across a shattered continent. and Dwight Eisenhower, the once relatively unknown officer from Kansas, now stood as one of the most recognized leaders in the world. But victory carries its own burdens. Peace would demand different skills, and new challenges awaited beyond the battlefield. The pen scratches softly against paper. It is a small sound, almost fragile, in a room that has witnessed the movement of armies. German officers stand rigid, uniforms still pressed, faces drawn with exhaustion. Cameras wait. Allied officers observe in silence. Outside, the war has not yet fully gone quiet, but inside this room in Reims, the fate of the Third Reich is being sealed by ink. Dwight Eisenhower does not sit at the center of the table. He stands apart, composed, watching history conclude in a gesture as simple as a signature. Years of thunder, of steel, of fire, ending in the quiet scrape of a pen. The German representatives signed the instrument of unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945. It will take effect at 1 minute past midnight the following day. There is no applause, no grand speeches, just acknowledgement. The war in Europe, the conflict that consumed continents and reshaped civilization, is over. Eisenhower had insisted on unconditional surrender. There would be no half measures, no negotiated compromises that allowed remnants of Nazi authority to survive. The German government under Admiral Karl Donitz had hoped to surrender only to Western forces, avoiding Soviet captivity. Eisenhower refused. The war had been fought by a coalition. It would end the same way. When the documents are signed, Eisenhower meets briefly with the German delegation. His tone is firm but restrained. There is no gloating. He understands the weight of the moment. Behind the formalities lies the knowledge of what has been uncovered. Concentration camps, devastated cities, millions displaced or dead. Outside Allied headquarters, word spreads quickly. Radios crackle. Crowds gather. In London, church bells ring for the first time in years. In Paris, people flood the streets, flags waving, laughter mixing with tears. In New York, strangers embrace beneath towering buildings. Victory in Europe Day, V-Day, becomes a celebration of survival. Eisenhower does not allow himself to be swept away by jubilation. His responsibilities are far from over. Millions of German soldiers must be disarmed and processed. Prisoners of war must be repatriated. Displaced persons, survivors of camps, forced laborers, refugees, require shelter and aid. The machinery of war must transition to the machinery of occupation. He tours Germany in the days following surrender. The landscape is scarred. Cities like Cologne and Frankfurt lie in ruins. Smoke still rises from shattered buildings. Roads are clogged with civilians pushing carts, searching for relatives, for food, for direction. The smell of dust and decay lingers in the air. Eisenhower visits liberated concentration camps again, ensuring documentation continues. He understands something critical. The world must see. Atrocities cannot be allowed to fade into rumor. He orders photographs, films, testimonies. Evidence must outlive the war. In meetings with Allied leaders, discussion shifts rapidly from combat to reconstruction. Zones of occupation are formalized. The division of Germany into sectors controlled by American, British, French, and Soviet forces becomes reality. Berlin itself is partitioned. Though guns are silent, new tensions begin to form beneath diplomatic language. Eisenhower is acutely aware that alliance unity during war does not guarantee harmony and peace. The Soviet Union has paid a staggering price on the Eastern Front. Their forces now occupy vast swaths of Eastern Europe. Political systems will be reshaped in the aftermath. The ideological divide between East and West, muted during common struggle, begins to sharpen. He continues to coordinate with Soviet commanders, maintaining professional respect. When American and Soviet troops first met at the Elbe River, it had been a moment of symbolic unity, smiles, handshakes, photographs capturing the closing of a ring around Germany. But beneath that symbolism lies uncertainty about what comes next. Eisenhower's leadership now demands diplomacy as much as military clarity. He communicates regularly with President Harry Truman, who has assumed office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. Truman inherits a complex global landscape. Europe devastated, the Pacific War ongoing, atomic research nearing completion. Though Europe celebrates, American forces remain deployed across a continent requiring stabilization. Food shortages threaten unrest. Infrastructure is shattered. Former Nazi officials must be identified and removed. Military governance becomes a delicate balance between control and restoration. Eisenhower travels among troops stationed in occupied Germany. The mood is mixed. Relief at survival mingles with homesickness and uncertainty. Soldiers who had stormed beaches and crossed rivers now find themselves directing traffic in ruined towns, guarding supply depots, overseeing surrendered units. He speaks with them directly, thanking them for endurance. He understands morale cannot simply evaporate with the end of fighting. Transition requires purpose. In private moments, Eisenhower reflects on the path that brought him here. From Abilene to West Point, from staff officer to supreme Allied commander. He had never commanded troops in combat before this war. Yet he had directed the largest amphibious invasion in history. His success rested not on battlefield heroics, but on coordination, aligning egos, balancing nations, maintaining cohesion under strain. His decision not to pursue Berlin becomes part of public discourse. Some argue that capturing the German capital would have strengthened Western influence in post-war negotiations. Others contend that the agreed-upon occupation zones rendered such a race unnecessary and costly. Eisenhower stands by his judgment. The objective had been to defeat German armies, not to chase symbolism. In June 1945, he returns briefly to the United States. Crowds line streets to welcome him. Confetti drifts from buildings. The sound of cheering echoes between skyscrapers. He remains modest, often redirecting praise to the soldiers and sailors who bore the brunt of combat. Yet his national stature is undeniable. He is no longer simply a general. He is a symbol of unity and victory. Political leaders take note. Public opinion views him as a figure of trust. He soon returns to Europe to continue overseeing occupation duties. The transition from wartime command to peacetime governance proves complex. Tensions with the Soviet Union escalate over Eastern Europe's political future. Disagreements about reparations, border changes, and displaced populations grow sharper. Eisenhower seeks to prevent misunderstandings from spiraling into confrontation. He understands the fragility of post-war stability. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany must not fracture immediately into hostility. Meanwhile, the Pacific War rages on. American forces battle fiercely on Okinawa. Casualties mount. Discussions of invading Japan intensify. The atomic bomb project, Manhattan Project, approaches completion. Though Eisenhower's direct role in the Pacific is limited, he remains engaged in strategic conversations. When atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, bringing Japan to surrender, the global war finally ends. The scale of destruction introduced by nuclear weapons reshapes strategic thinking permanently. Eisenhower begins to consider the implications of such power. Victory has been achieved, but at the dawn of a new, more dangerous era. He returns to the United States again in triumph, yet carries within him the knowledge of what modern war has become. He had witnessed industrialized slaughter, strategic bombing, genocide, and now atomic devastation. The future will demand leaders who understand both power and restraint. By the end of 1945, Dwight Eisenhower steps down as Supreme Allied Commander and is appointed Army Chief of Staff. His wartime chapter closes, but his influence continues. The journey from unknown officer to global commander has transformed him. The qualities that elevated him, patience, coordination, humility, and authority, remain central to his identity. He has proven that leadership in modern war is not about personal bravado, but about managing complexity without losing moral clarity. In the quiet after victory, he visits once more the cemeteries in Europe where rows of white crosses stretch across green fields. The wind moves softly through grass. The names etched in stone represent the cost of every decision he made. He stands silently, absorbing the weight of memory. The war in Europe ended with a signature, but its consequences will shape generations. Germany lies divided. Europe begins reconstruction. The United States emerges as a global superpower. The Soviet Union expands its sphere. The Cold War shadow lengthens, even as celebration lingers. Eisenhower's story does not end here, but this chapter, the war, does. He commanded the invasion of Normandy. He balanced the ambitions of Patton and Montgomery. He chose restraint over glory at Berlin. He demanded unconditional surrender. He ensured the world bore witness to atrocity. The boy from Kansas who once played football on frozen fields had navigated the most complex military coalition in history and guided it to victory. As he looks toward a future beyond the battlefield, the lessons of war remain etched into his character. Power must be balanced with responsibility. Unity must be preserved even amid difference. And leadership, at its core, is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It is about holding the room together when history hangs in the balance. The guns are silent now. Europe breathes again, and Dwight Eisenhower stands at the threshold of a new era, shaped forever by the war he helped end.